Hi everybody, thank you very much for watching, I very much appreciate it. I'm Orlando Ruiz Jr. and welcome to another classic movie review. Only this is not just a review of one film, and it's not going to be a complete review of each title, but this is going to be my top 25 movies of the 1980s. Last year I did my top 25 of the 1990s, and that one was broken up into three parts, and I'm going to try to do things a little different with this one. It's all going to be just one video, so hope you're up for it. If there are any movies from the 80s that didn't make it onto my list, but you put on your list, please put those names of those titles down in the comment section. I'd very much like to check that out. I'm curious about stuff like that. So, okay, now I'm gonna get to it. The list, my top 25 movies of the 1980s, and my number 25 film. Man, this was hard to narrow down, but here we go. 1987's The Lost Boys, directed by Joel Schumacher, one of the great vampire movies of all time, in my opinion. Probably my favorite of all time. And I'm not going to go too much into it because I have a review on this movie on the channel that I did last year, last October. This movie tells the story of a couple of teenagers, Sam and his older brother Michael, who with their mother after she gets a divorce, move to Santa Clara, which turns out to be the murder capital of the world. And they're trying to make friends, and Sam gravitates to a couple of kids called the Frog Brothers, while Michael gravitates to a group of cool looking kids that turn out to be vampires. And this movie is known for its very cool soundtrack. It has a very cool look as far as costumes and the makeup effects on the vampires. There's some cool gore in this movie, and it's just a lot of fun because the characters are very fun to watch and very memorable. You have Corey Haim, the late Corey Haim, who did a great job in this movie. Jason Patric is awesome in this movie. Of course, I gotta mention Kiefer Sutherland, who is one of the all-time great movie bad guys, and it's just a very fun vampire flick from the 80s that kind of put vampire movies in a different direction, I think. Put a little spin on the lore. And it was definitely very unique for the time, and to this day still feels very unique because of all the very stylistic choices made by Joel Schumacher. And yeah, this is one of my favorite movies of this decade, and I love it so much I have to revisit it quite often, and especially during the month of October. At number 24 of my top 20 movies of the 1980s, we have Beverly Hills Cop from 1984. Eddie Murphy plays Axel Foley, a Detroit cop who has a friend that's murdered, and when his boss orders him to stay off the case, Foley pretends to go on vacation, only he decides that he's going to go to Beverly Hills to investigate the murder of his friend. And of course, he ends up pissing off a lot of the local police, and things get kind of hairy pretty quickly, but Foley is great at sort of thinking on his toes, and you get to see a great showcase of a very cool detective that is very good at improvising in certain moments when it calls for it. And you can tell that Murphy is having a blast playing this role. You can tell that he's improvising a lot of his scenes. As the main villain of the movie, you have character actor Steven Berkoff, who I always enjoyed whenever I saw him pop up in a movie as a bad guy. He would play a bad guy quite a bit back in the day. And just a year before this, he was one of the bad guys in Octopussy, one of my favorite Roger Moore Bond films. And he was a character actor that would always make very interesting choices as an actor, which made his characters all the more memorable. Eddie Murphy kills it in the role of Axel Foley in one of the most rewatchable action comedies I've ever seen. This is a movie that I rewatch quite often, and it's one of my favorite movies of all time, which is why it makes my top 25 of the 1980s list. Again, at number 24, Beverly Hills Cop. Definitely a must watch, and if you haven't seen this one, check this one out. It is a comedy classic. This is movie gold as far as I'm concerned. At number 23 on my list, we have Tim Burton's Batman from 1989, with a casting of Jack Nicholson, which helped to set a new precedent for big name actors that wanted to play villains in superhero movies. After this, it kind of became a trend in Hollywood. And not only that, but this also started the trend of the big tentpole superhero film, the big blockbuster summer superhero film. And of course, this was something that would really blow up about 10 years later with the event of, like Blade and X-Men, and then of course Sam Raimi's Spider-Man films. After the huge success of 1989's Batman, Hollywood would try time and time again for about 10 years to try and replicate that success with movies like Sam Raimi's Darkman. Of course, you had The Shadow, you had The Crow, you had Blade, you had X-Men, and all of these movies would feature the same kind of trope with the main character, a hero all in black. Even the X-Men's costumes were changed because Hollywood wasn't ready to go full comic booky, trying to have their movies be a little edgier and appeal to adults, not just kids. This movie has a very simple premise. It's basically Batman's year one. It's like the first 6 months that he's been fighting crime, and so all the cops are aware of him, but they're not sure exactly if he's a good guy or a bad guy. Some people aren't even sure if he's human or not. We get to see the birth of the Joker, and all the low-level criminals are aware of Batman, and they all fear him. And to see Batman battling the Joker in this movie is a comic book movie lover's dream. I could go on and on about why I love this movie so much, but I don't want to keep gushing on this movie because I have other movies I got to get to. And so if you want to check out more of my thoughts on this film, I do have a 15-minute review on 1989's Batman on my channel. So if you're interested in that, check it out. I did it last year. The number 22 film of my top 25 movies of the 1980s is 1982's First Blood, starring the great Sylvester Stallone as one of his signature roles as John Rambo. This was directed by Ted Kotcheff, and basically you have Vietnam veteran John Rambo who is traveling, going from one place to another, kind of like Bill Bixby's Incredible Hulk. In the role of the main antagonist of the movie, you have the late great Brian Dennehy in the role of Sheriff Will Teasel, who is very easy to dislike in this movie because, of course, Dennehy was a very great actor and gives a terrific performance in the film. And one of the reasons why he's so easy to dislike is because he's basically a guy just denying another guy a meal when one guy is passing through his town. There are some great stunts in this movie and some very exciting action sequences that are very fun to watch. But of course, in the sequels, they would go very over the top and the action would become a lot more bombastic and, more blood, more explosions. But there's something about this first film that feels very earnest and feels very raw and real, given that America was kind of coming out of the Vietnam War, and so it was still kind of dealing with the after effects. And the great thing about this film is it kind of speaks on behalf on many of the veterans. Sylvester Stallone has a great monologue towards the end of the film that every time I rewatch it, it's always very heartbreaking and very heartfelt. And this movie has some of the best action, badass lines as far as Stallone saying things like, "I could have killed them all, could have killed you. Don't push it, I'll give you a war you won't believe. Let it go." So many badassery moments in this movie, and one of my favorite action films, and one of my favorite films of all time. First Blood definitely deserves a spot on this list, and so that is why it is at my number 22 spot. Alrighty, at number 21. Yes, John Hughes had to make it on this list, but not The Breakfast Club, sorry. Not Uncle Buck. As much as I wanted to include Uncle Buck, I have to admit my favorite John Hughes comedy film is Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, starring the great Steve Martin and the late great John Candy. May he rest in peace. I've always enjoyed John Candy's comedies. These two comedic legends played so perfectly off of each other, so seamlessly, that you really felt like these two were actual friends in this movie, even though through this movie they kind of, have a little bit of bickering back and forth, which is basically part of the overall plot, which is one guy really finds the other guy annoying. They're kind of traveling together, trying to get from New York City all the way to Chicago. And in doing so, they take, planes and then, yeah, you guessed it, a train, and then eventually automobiles. And this is just a very fun road trip movie that has tremendous heart. Steve Martin is one of the great comedic geniuses of all time. He's one of the funniest men to have ever walked the planet. I really love him in movies like Roxanne, All of Me, Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid, The Man with Two Brains, of course, The Jerk, and there's My Blue Heaven, there's LA Story. The list goes on and on. He is one of the all-time greats. But of course, he is joined by another one of the all-time greats in John Candy, one of my favorite people to ever walk the planet as well. And John Candy, enough can't be said about this guy. He was not just funny, but he was also very endearing. And I love him in movies like Uncle Buck and The Great Outdoors. Of course, eventually I do plan on doing a full-on review on this movie and give you my more in-depth thoughts, like I will with many of the films on this list that I haven't already given full-on reviews of. But look out for that review this November, The Untouchables, based on the old classic TV show. Yes, this was a TV show back in the day, and the script was written by none other than playwright David Mamet, who the same year as this also directed one of my favorite films of the year, House of Games. I have a review of that movie on this channel if you want to check it out. The Untouchables stars Kevin Costner, Robert De Niro, Andy Garcia, and you have Sir Sean Connery as Malloy. And De Niro plays Al Capone in this film, and Costner plays Elliot Ness. This movie takes place in the 1930s. It is a time when liquor is illegal because of prohibition, and you have the character of Elliot Ness, who is a treasury agent assigned to stop Al Capone. There is like this gang war happening with control of the booze rackets in the streets of Chicago. And because the cinematography in this film looks excellent, Chicago looks great in this movie, and I really love the time period, the suits, the hats and ties, the old cars. The music score for this movie is very suspenseful and very exciting. It was done by Ennio Morricone, who did the music for the Sergio Leone spaghetti western films starring Clint Eastwood, like A Fistful of Dollars and A Few Dollars More, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And he also scored more recently Tarantino's The Hateful Eight, which is also an awesome score. Even though Robert De Niro doesn't have tons of screen time in the film, his presence is felt all throughout the movie because his character is being constantly referenced by the other characters, and also he steals every scene that he's in. And whenever you watch him on screen, you can tell he's having tons of fun in the part of Al Capone. Overall, I really love this movie, and I can't wait to get into a more in-depth review of this movie eventually. But this movie is my number 20, and I love it to death. At number 19 on my top 25 movies of the 1980s, we got one of my favorite comedies of all time from 1988, Big, starring Tom Hanks, Elizabeth Perkins, John Hurd, and Robert Loggia. This movie was directed by Laverne DeFazio herself, the great Penny Marshall. It's a little deep cut for Laverne and Shirley fans. And this is a comedy about a 13-year-old 80s kid that goes out one night with his parents, and they're at a carnival or some kind of fair, and he wants to get on a ride with a girl that he has a crush on. He gets a little embarrassed when they tell him he can't get on the ride because he's not tall enough, he's not big enough. In the morning, he wakes up, only it's not the kid that we saw in the beginning of the movie. It turns out to be Tom Hanks. Same character, just he got his wish. His wish was to be big, and so for the rest of the movie, we get to see this guy kind of uh, basically being a 13-year-old in a 30-year-old guy's body, and it makes for some very funny situations. When this movie came out, Tom Hanks was mainly known for comedies at the time, and Hollywood was pretty much casting him in the kind of roles that they would cast someone like Bill Murray, like the fun-loving guy that was always kind of a nice guy, but always very kind of silly. Big was really his first kind of stretch into mixing a little drama in there, because even though this is a full-on comedy, it gets kind of moving and rather touching in some moments. And Tom Hanks really displayed, I think, for the first time what he was capable of as not just a comedic actor, but a serious actor, which earned him his very first Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. And this is one of those movies that once you watch it, you kind of want to watch it over and over again. At least for me, it was. And that's one of the reasons why it is one of my all-time favorite 1980s movies. I think that I can go into more reasons, but I won't do that in this video because I want to save that for when I do give a more in-depth look into this movie for its own review. But that is my number 19. At number 18 on my list, we got 1986's Stand By Me, directed by Rob Reiner. This is based on a Stephen King story. It won't surprise you to hear that this movie can get quite dark at times, since the plot does involve these four young preteens going on the search for a missing dead body, somebody that lives in their town, a fellow teenager basically. And so they have the idea that if they find the body, they'll become famous and they'll be on TV and on the radio and stuff. And so they pack a few things and they go on this very long walk through the woods, following the train tracks. And there's a very iconic scene involving train tracks and a train. There is moments of great levity in the film between the four characters who, stop at times to camp and tell jokes and tell stories. There are moments where they have situations where it gets kind of serious, especially when it could be life threatening, and all these guys sort of have each other's backs, and it's just a very good story. And the direction of this movie from Rob Reiner is excellent throughout the whole movie. This is a great movie, and this is a movie that I do want to talk about on my channel and give it its own review, because I do have a lot more to say on this movie. So I will save more of that for when I do talk about it eventually. And the movie is a great movie, so it deserves that. And so I will get to it eventually. But for now, that's all I have to say on this 80s classic Stand By Me. But it is my number 18 and one of my favorite films of all time. Okay, number 17 on the list. This is a movie that I have covered on my channel, so don't want to go too deep about the movie, but if those of you that are fans of the Coen brothers, you gotta check this out eventually. This is one of their early films from 1987, Raising Arizona, starring you got Nicolas Cage, Holly Hunter, John Goodman, William Forsythe. In this movie, Nicolas Cage, a pretty young Nicolas Cage, is known as a repeat offender, as he's referred to in the movie, and he's in and out of jail because he's constantly getting in trouble for robbery. Only it's unarmed robbery because the gun is never loaded. And he meets a woman, Holly Hunter. They fall in love. She is a cop, and she has a problem as far as her insides, which they're a rocky place where his seed can find no purchase. Love that line from this movie. And so, because she can't have kids, they decide they're going to basically kidnap a kid because they see on TV that somebody known as Nathan Arizona, him and his wife, had five little babies. The direction from the Coen brothers in this movie is really out there. The movie is kind of out there, but that's one of the things that makes this movie so damn charming. These people do feel like they just really want to be parents and they just want to have their own little family unit. And yeah, they kidnap somebody else's baby, but it makes for many funny situations, especially when people come over and they have to explain the baby and how it, all of a sudden overnight they just have one. And um, Nick Cage is hilarious in this movie. If you're into a great comedy, I definitely highly encourage you to check this one out, especially if you're a fan of the Coen brothers. For me, this is one of their best films, and I think it's my favorite comedy of theirs. Even though I love The Big Lebowski, Raising Arizona is one of their all-time great movies, and I still think it's their best comedy. So yeah, that is definitely my number 17 movie on the list. Okay, number 16 on my top 25 movies of the 1980s, we have a James Cameron film. And as much as I wanted to include 1984's Terminator, it got beat out by 1986's Aliens. This is a movie that is a freaking roller coaster ride from beginning to end. It never lets up. It is action filled, but it's also terrifying. This is one of those movies that once you watch it, you want to rewatch this thing over and over again because of how badass and fun and scary and thrilling, and not to mention the performance from Sigourney Weaver, a performance that would get her an Oscar. Her performance in the movie really draws you in, as well as the rest of the supporting cast, which is tons of fun to watch. With young Bill Paxton in the movie, may he rest in peace. Also, Michael Biehn in there, and quite a few actors from the stable of actors that James Cameron would often use. This is one of those movies that completely excites you, it thrills you, horrifies you, and it has many intense moments that I think kind of stay with you because of a lot of the imagery and a lot of the great shots. James Cameron is one of those directors that's a visionary and really knows how to frame a great shot. This movie also has a terrific score from James Horner, who would go on to score movies like Clear and Present Danger and Titanic and The Mask of Zorro. And of course, you got to talk about the special effects in this movie. The effects in this movie for the 1980s are excellent, and some of the effects aren't going to age too well for people that are very much used to the glossiness of CGI. But I've always enjoyed the tangibility of practical effects, and even though you can tell there's a lot of shots using a lot of blue screen, it's the practical effects that really are a standout in this movie. So that combined with great A performances, top-notch directing from Cameron, and a very fun and thrilling story make for one of the most memorable science fiction films of all time. Number 15 on my list, I have my all-time favorite teen comedy from 1983, Risky Business, starring Tom Cruise. Cruise plays a senior in high school named Joel, and while Joel's parents are gone, he wants to engage in some very adult activity, if you know what I mean. And so he gets the number of a escort service, and his first attempt is not very successful. It's actually a pretty funny moment in the movie. But his second attempt is when a young lady shows up at the door named Lana, played by Rebecca De Mornay, who is a very talented actress, appeared in movies like Guilty as Sin, The Hand That Rocks the Cradle. She was also in Ron Howard's Backdraft. And here, her and Tom Cruise have some very steamy chemistry. There are some scenes that are definitely not intended for younger viewers. This movie also has actor Curtis Armstrong as one of Joel's high school friends in the movie. He was in the Revenge of the Nerds movies back in the day as Booger, an iconic 80s high school movie teen character. He was also in Better Off Dead, starring John Cusack, which is also one of my favorite 80s teen comedies. And fans of American Dad will recognize his voice as the voice of Snot in that great TV show. But he gets one of the best lines in this movie when during a car chase because Joel takes out his dad's car, of which he is not supposed to. You know that classic teen movie trope. And they're being chased by Joey Pantoliano's character Guido, and he says something like, "We're being chased by Guido, the killer pimp." Of course, something very bad happens to that car, by the way, and when it does, Joel has to come up with a serious amount of money in order to get the car fixed before his parents come home and his dad finds out. And what he does do to raise money, I don't want to give away because that's one of the big surprises. I think that if you haven't seen this movie, it's pretty cool to see it unfold, and it has a great payoff by the end of the movie. But I will definitely go into this more in a full on review eventually because it is one of my favorite films of the 80s, and that is why it makes my number 15 spot on this list. Risky Business from 83. Check it out. In at my number 14 spot of my top 25 movies of the 1980s, I have a movie from 1988, Die Hard, starring Bruce Willis in the role that would make him a movie star, directed by John McTiernan. Prior to Die Hard, the action movie hero types were mainly these big, brawny muscleman guys like Schwarzenegger or Stallone, or your karate guys like Chuck Norris. But then Bruce Willis came along in Die Hard and kind of began a new action hero movie trope of the everyday, normal, average looking guy, of which, you know, he kind of had like a regular build and he was a guy that your average Joe could kind of relate to. And the second being, after Die Hard, it began a string of the action kind of terrorist movies with movies like Under Siege, which was Die Hard on a battleship. You had Passenger 57, which was like Die Hard on a plane. You had Under Siege 2, which was Die Hard on a train. Of course, there's one of my favorites, Cliffhanger, which was basically Die Hard in the mountains. And it kind of went on and on for about a decade with these, you know, action terrorist themed movies. This movie also has a great performance from the late Alan Rickman, may he rest in peace, as one of the all-time great movie villains, Hans Gruber. And Hans Gruber and 11 other terrorists take over the Nakatomi building in LA on Christmas Eve, of which John McClane is visiting his wife at. He comes from New York, he's a New York cop, and so when he's there at the Christmas party, the terrorists show up and John isn't wearing any shoes, so he's running around the building barefoot the entire night. Watching John McClane pick off bad guys barefoot in this building is something that's very entertaining, especially on rewatches, because it isn't just a fun action movie, it's also a very suspenseful movie. No matter how many times I rewatch this movie, it always feels very intense given that it does take place in one location, this 40-story building, which feels very enclosed in certain moments, and so it really adds to a lot of the tension of the film. And it's a movie that I rewatch in the summertime or around the holidays, given that I do consider this a Christmas film. At number 13, I have a movie directed by Steven Spielberg. As much as I really wanted to put the original on this list, I just couldn't because I had to be honest with myself because this one is my favorite of this series, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. This actually is my little box set of the first four films, so I just wanted to show you the inside a little bit where we see, you know, the second film right there. And yeah, this is a really cool box set. It's one of my favorite box sets that I own. That has got to be my favorite poster of the movie. Let you see that a little closer. That is a badass poster. I definitely can understand how some of the people of today can find some of the scenes in this movie a tad offensive, given how it depicts certain aspects of certain cultures, but I don't think this movie is meant to be a documentary. You know, it's really just a fun piece of entertainment, and it's a great adventure involving Indiana Jones trying to save a village from this creepy cult. This movie has the best action sequences in the entire series, in my opinion, and I love the opening that takes place in Shanghai where Indiana Jones drinks that poison by mistake, and then he has to get the antidote, all that chaos that ensues. And then, of course, the plane escape sequence, which is also always very exciting. Even every time I rewatch it, I really get a lot of fun out of that. And then you have all the stuff in the mine car, that entire chase, all that voodoo stuff is very creepy with, the creepy cult, and Moho Ram, I think, is one of the best villains in the entire series. Overall, this is just a very fun adventure film. It has a lot of great moments of suspense as well. And even on rewatches, I still get a big kick out of it. And I do think it is the best film in the series, for me anyways, even though I really love Raiders of the Lost Ark, and I also really love The Last Crusade. That one for a long time was my favorite, but I had to go back and forth in choosing my personal favorite, and when I couldn't deny this one in the end, I had to give it my number 13 spot because it happens to be one of my all-time favorite Spielberg films and one of my favorite films of all time. Number 12 on the list from director Robert Zemeckis is a movie that came out in 1985. You guessed it, Back to the Future. This is another really cool little box set. One of the best film trilogies ever. The plot of this movie revolves around high school kid Marty McFly, played by the awesome Michael J. Fox, who is friends with a scientist played by the great Christopher Lloyd in the role of Doc Brown. And Doc Brown has invented a time machine out of a car, a DeLorean. And Marty gets in the car at one point early in the movie, and when he takes it up to 88 miles per hour, he goes back in time to 1955, where he gets to meet his parents before they ever met. By Marty interacting with his teenage mother and his teenage father, he accidentally changes the course of history to the point where his own existence becomes in jeopardy. And Marty now has to get his mother and father together to fall in love. And this is a great premise that I think a lot of families can really appreciate and enjoy because of all the humor that comes out of these situations. And some people might get a little weirded out by some of the stuff between Marty and his mother, given how his mother takes quite a shine to him and gets kind of a crush on her own future son. Of course, she doesn't know it's him, and we all know that she's going to be his mom, and so it can get a little bit weird at times. The movie also has great performances from the supporting cast from actors like Crispin Glover, Leah Thompson, Thomas Wilson in the role of Biff as one of the all-time great movie bullies, and he's hilarious throughout this trilogy. And I do want to get into this movie a bit more in its own review, which I will eventually get to, but for now, that's all I'm going to say on this one. It is my number 12 on the list, 1988's Rain Man. This is the movie that won the Oscar that year for Best Picture, and this is a movie that every now and then, whenever I rewatch it, it always gets to me. Rain Man is a very touching and moving story about a young man, Charlie Babbitt, played by Tom Cruise, who in the film learns that he has a brother, played by Dustin Hoffman, as the character of Raymond. And Raymond is autistic, and it takes an entire film for Charlie to understand what that means. And at the time of this movie's release, a lot of people in the general public didn't really understand what autism was, and this movie was basically like our education on the subject. There are quite a few moments in the movie where Cruise's character Charlie can be quite mean to his brother Raymond, played by Hoffman, but it's because he gets really frustrated with him and because he just doesn't understand his condition. But throughout the movie, little by little, they have great moments of bonding between one brother and another brother, and there's great revelations throughout the movie that come off really, really strong, even on repeat viewings, and it's a movie that always tugs at my heartstrings every time I rewatch it. And Hoffman gives one of the greatest performances of his career in this movie. A couple of my favorite moments in the film revolve around the two brothers ending up in Las Vegas at one point, and Charlie gets his brother Raymond fitted for an outfit, and then you see them coming down the escalator in a casino getting ready to do some serious gambling, and the two of them are wearing these matching suits. It's a very cool moment that I remember they paid homage to in The Hangover when you see Bradley Cooper and Zach Galifianakis coming down an escalator, and I think Galifianakis was wearing the same exact suit in that moment. This is a very well-made film with two great performances from its two lead actors, and there are many moments in this movie that will definitely put a smile on one's face. But it also has moments in the movie where it just might break your heart a little bit, and I think there are valid reasons why this movie won 4 Academy Awards at the 1989 Oscars for Best Screenplay, Best Director, Best Actor, and Best Picture. I think those awards were very well deserved. This is one of my favorite films of the 1980s, which is why I honestly believe it deserves a high spot on my list of top 25 movies of the 1980s, which is why Rain Man makes my number 11 spot. If you want to check out my full review of this film, it's already on my channel, so there it is. Okay, moving on to the top 10 finally, huh? Number 10, 1981's Blowout, directed by the great Brian De Palma, whose film The Untouchables also made this list. This movie stars John Travolta, Nancy Allen, John Lithgow, the late Dennis Franz, may he rest in peace. And it's the story of a man named Jack Terry, played by Travolta, who is a sound effects guy who works for the movies. He's out late one night recording for a certain project when all of a sudden a car nearby has an accident and it goes right off of the bridge and into a river. And Travolta's character records the whole thing, the sound, anyways. But as soon as he notices that someone's in trouble inside the car, he puts his equipment down, jumps right into the water, and there are two people in the back seat, a man and a woman. He doesn't have the time to save the man, but he saves the woman before she's able to drown. And people start to ask questions, and he kind of tries to reveal that there was somebody else besides the man in the back seat to the authorities, but they try to keep it under wraps that the man had a woman in the back seat because it turns out that he was a respected politician. And Travolta's character is the guy that tries to get to the bottom of the entire thing because he knows that there's something wrong when people are trying to cover up the information he's trying to give. And it's a very well made thriller. It gets very exciting very quickly, especially once he realizes that Travolta's character is in over his head. In this movie, he's playing just a normal guy. He's not a detective. He's not like this cop or anything. He's just a guy that works for a sound effects company. And they try to shut him up in different ways, try to discredit him. Old school movie fans will recognize Nancy Allen as Lewis from the RoboCop films. She was also in Brian De Palma's Dressed to Kill and his film Carrie from 1976. She was a real bitch in that movie. And she does a very good job in this film as Sally, who is the character that Travolta saves, who's in the back seat in the car that goes in the water. And as I mentioned before, this movie also has John Lithgow, who can be a real scumbag in certain movies, and he can also be very funny in TV shows like Third Rock from the Sun or in other comedy films. But he can also play a great villain in films like Ricochet and Cliffhanger, and in this film, in which he definitely plays another evil character. I do have a review of this movie on my channel if you want to check that out because, like I said, it turned out to be one of my favorite movies of this decade, which is why it made my list at number 10. 1981's Blowout. Look for it, and if you want to check out my review, it's on my channel. Okie dokie. Number 9 on my list. Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. Also a movie that I have reviewed on this channel, kind of recently actually. And it's the story of a very hot day in Brooklyn with Spike Lee himself playing the character of Mookie. You got Danny Aiello in there, who has his own pizzeria place. Danny Aiello plays the character of Sal, and he has a couple of sons that work for him at the pizzeria. One of them is Pino, played by John Turturro, who is very funny in a lot of movies. He's great in The Big Lebowski, and he's also great in movies like Miller's Crossing as well. And in this film, Pino is kind of at odds with Mookie, who is played by Spike Lee, and every now and then they have a little bit of bickering, but they do seem to have kind of a mutual understanding at one point in the movie. It's basically a day in the life kind of story on this very hot day in Brooklyn, where things kind of escalate to a certain point where towards the end of the film something happens that I don't want to give away, but it's something that is very relevant to this day. This movie also features a couple of very fine actors from old Hollywood, Ozzie Davis and Ruby Dee, who are very sadly not with us anymore, so may they rest in peace, and also has Rosie Perez in it, who at the beginning of the film does a bit of a dance number during the opening sequence of the movie, and she plays Mookie's girlfriend in the film, and the two of them share a son who lives with her, and her mother gets really pissed off whenever Mookie comes around because he's kind of a deadbeat dad, and he makes just a little bit of money with his pizza delivery job, of which he is not a very good pizza delivery guy. He's out pretty late, more than he has to be, kind of messes around on the job. And this is a movie filled with people that throughout the film are constantly not doing the right thing. This is a movie that every time I rewatch it, I thoroughly enjoy it. And ever since the first time I did see it, I knew it was going to be one of my favorite films of this decade, which is why it has to make this spot at number 9 on my list of top 25 movies of the 80s. Do the Right Thing. It's one of my favorite films. Has a review already on this channel, so if you want to check that out, I appreciate it. Okay, number 8. The Shining from Stanley Kubrick came out in 1980. Everybody knows that Stephen King was very pissed off with the outcome of this film, but who cares? It was a great film regardless. And of course, Jack Nicholson gives one of the greatest performances of his career, maybe the greatest. I think his performance in this movie was considered very over the top by a lot of people, but this is a very underrated performance by a lot of critics because it didn't even get nominated for an Academy Award, which I think is an outright crime. This is a very creepy movie. The tone of the movie has this real sense of dread all throughout the film, and this is a movie that is very rewatchable because of the immaculate cinematography, the very kind of eerie music score, and great performances from everybody involved, including the little boy who plays Danny Torrance. You got Shelley Duvall, and it's a story about this family in this hotel, very secluded hotel known as the Overlook Hotel, and they're there for the winter. It's a very harsh winter. It gets very snowy, and there's a blizzard that happens towards the end of the film. And very slowly throughout the movie, the character of Jack Torrance, played by Nicholson, becomes very unhinged. This is a movie that I cannot wait to get into a deep dive of when October comes around, because when this October does come, all I'm going to talk about is classic horror movies, and I'm sure The Shining is going to be one of those films that I talk about since I haven't talked about it yet. But I'm going to save most of my thoughts for that overall review. But I just want you guys to know that this is a movie that I very much love because I could have put any number of horror movies from this decade on this list, given how this is a decade filled with great classic horror movies. You got A Nightmare on Elm Street, you got The Evil Dead, Pet Sematary, Friday the 13th. It goes on and on and on. I love the horror movie genre, especially the horror films of the 1980s. However, even though there were so many great horror films that came out during the decade of the 80s, I think that when The Shining came out in the first year of that decade, it was a very tough act to follow for subsequent horror movies. It is one of the greatest films of all time as far as I'm concerned. Stanley Kubrick did a great job directing the film. It is a legendary horror movie. It even got a sequel very recently with Doctor Sleep, which is a movie that I very much enjoyed. This is a movie that you should check out, not just if you're a horror fan, but if you're a fan of film in general. It's a movie that if you haven't seen, and if you're not afraid of creepy movies, definitely give it a go, especially if you're a fan of the work of the great Stephen King. Even though he may not be a fan of this film, I never could understand why. I guess it's because the movie strayed a lot from the source material. But again, Kubrick did an amazing job with this film, and because of that, and because it is one of my favorites, it deserves the spot of my number 8 on this list. At number 7, I have a movie from 1989. Once again, Tom Cruise strikes again. Believe it or not, I did not plan it that way to have 3 Tom Cruise movies on this list. I would have loved to have made more room for other actors to make the list in some great movies, but the man just happened to be in some classics back then. The 80s was a very big decade for Tom Cruise, and this was directed by Oliver Stone, who also made many great films back in the day. Movies like Platoon and JFK. He even wrote the screenplay for Scarface 83. And this is just a very great film, great drama based on a true story on a book written by Ron Kovic, which the movie is based on, the character that Tom Cruise plays in the film. Early in the film, Cruise's character, Ron Kovic, is a very young, eager, patriotic young man who buys into a lot of the communist rhetoric of the time. And he goes off to Vietnam after enlisting in the Marines right out of high school. And when he comes back, he ends up coming back without his legs. He ends up in a wheelchair. And the experiences that his character endures are very hard to watch at times, especially when he's in the VA hospital. And then he does come back eventually to his home where he finds he doesn't have the welcome that he probably thought he would have. He ends up finding out that not everybody felt the same way about Vietnam as he did, and the way people felt about it back when he enlisted and went to Vietnam is something that changes throughout time. And as time kind of keeps going, his own character kind of develops a different point of view through the experiences that he has when he comes back from the war. And it's one of my favorite character arcs in any film. This is a very unforgettable story. I think it's very moving, very powerful. It can be emotionally gut wrenching at times. It's a sad film at times. But for anyone that's ever stayed behind while others went out to fight in their stead in a faraway land, I think we owe it to our veterans to watch and hear their stories and to see their films that are about real people, this being one of them. Ron Kovic was a real person who went off and lost his legs and came back with a different perspective after he experienced enough hardships and went through a lot of hard times with his family and friends. And this is just overall a very great piece of filmmaking from the 1980s. All right, we're at number six now. At number six is Blade Runner, the final cut, directed by Ridley Scott, one of the all time great science fiction films. And like a lot of people, I had to rewatch this movie a few times to really get it. I remember seeing it as a young kid, thinking it was going to be more of an action film, and not really being all that into it. But the older I got, the more I sort of came around on rewatches because I really dig film noir. And later on, when I realized this movie was basically a sci-fi film noir kind of movie, it really drew me in from that aspect. And Harrison Ford as Deckard is one of the all-time great badass characters in science fiction films. You have Rutger Hauer as the villain of this movie. This movie also features a very young Daryl Hannah. You have Edward James Olmos. You have Sean Young in the film. And it's based on a story by Philip K. Dick, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And Philip K. Dick's stories are some of the greatest in science fiction. Many great films have been based on a few of his works, movies like Total Recall and Minority Report. Blade Runner is one of the most seminal science fiction films of its time, and as you watch other films that came after it, you realize just how influential this movie was, just in terms of the art direction and the look of the world and the production design and the cars and the costumes. Even a lot of films that would come out in the 90s that felt very cyberpunk felt like they were very highly influenced and felt like they could have taken place in the same world as Blade Runner. I also very much love the music score all throughout this movie. It has that great 80s kind of synth score that a lot of people kind of identify with this decade. And this is another one of those movies that I have yet to talk about on my channel, but I cannot wait to get to giving this movie its own review because I have so much to say about Blade Runner. And this is another one of those greatest movies of the decade that everybody needs to check out, especially if you're a Ridley Scott fan or a fan of science fiction or a Harrison Ford fan. So if you are any of those things, definitely seek out 1982's Blade Runner. Number 5 from 1986, Platoon, written and directed by Oliver Stone. This is a drama about the Vietnam War, and Oliver Stone himself was in the Vietnam War, and so the movie is based on many of his own experiences. This is one of the most realistic and gritty depictions about the war in Vietnam, as U.S. soldiers have to navigate their way through a living nightmare. This is a gripping morality tale about one's duty to humanity against the tyranny of evil, and representing that evil in the film is the character of Sergeant Barnes, played by Tom Berenger, who would go on to be nominated for the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. He didn't win it, but he wasn't the only one. This movie also has Willem Dafoe, was also nominated for his work in this film in the same category, playing the role of Sergeant Elias. Overall, the movie is told through the eyes of Charlie Sheen's character Taylor. At the beginning of the film, we see him newly arrived in Vietnam, and slowly throughout the movie becomes more and more jaded through his experiences with his platoon. Defoe's character, Sergeant Elias, is kind of a badass, and all the men seem to look up to him. He's this guy that kind of takes charge, and at the same time, he's also like the voice of reason within the platoon. And at the other end of that spectrum, you have the Tom Berenger character, Sergeant Barnes, who's a lot more tougher on the men. He's kind of brutish, and he has no qualms in killing innocent civilians. And this is where a lot of the conflict within the film stems. And eventually, the men kind of got to take sides. The film goes through some of the gray parts of war as well as showing us some of the ugliest parts of war through the eyes of Charlie Sheen's character Taylor, as he's kind of walking that line between good and evil and kind of teetering between being more like Elias or more like Barnes. And this is a very memorable war film. It's one of my favorite war films. It does have moments of levity here and there with bits of humor throughout all the chaos and madness, but this is one of the great films of the 80s, and eventually I will give it its own review, like many of the films that haven't yet gotten full reviews on my channel. But this movie is my number 5. It is one of my favorite films of all time, and it's one of the best works from director Oliver Stone. So yeah, Platoon. Seek this movie out if you haven't seen it. Definitely worth your time. Okay, number 4, people. Another film that Oliver Stone did have some involvement in, not as director, but he did write the screenplay for this. This was directed by the great Brian De Palma and stars none other than the great Al Pacino, Scarface. Yeah, this movie is a great remake, one of the greatest remakes of all time. The movie also has Stephen Bauer as Manny. You have Robert Loggia as Frank Lopez. as Elvira, however he says it. You have Michelle Pfeiffer. In this version of the film, this is the story of Tony Montana, who is played by one of the greatest actors of all time, Mr. Al Pacino, who in the film is joined by Stephen Bauer as his friend Manny. And at the beginning of the film, the two of them are two of the many thousands of Cuban refugees that are brought to Florida from Cuba at the behest of Fidel Castro. And Al Pacino goes very, very big with his performance as Tony Montana in this film. Very similarly to the 1932 black and white original, this is a rags to riches tale, but it's also much more broader in scope and scale and in story, which makes the film feel much more epic in its execution. And it is a 3 hour film, and it goes by really quick because the pace is relentless. Very shortly after their arrival in Florida, Tony and his friend Manny find themselves working at a Cuban sandwich stand where Tony works as a dishwasher. But not for long because through their connections, through Manny's connections with the criminal underworld in Florida, Tony quickly manages to rise in the ranks, killing his way up to the top. And this is a movie with a badass soundtrack all throughout the film. This movie retains a couple of the same story elements from the 1932 classic, like Tony and his relationship with his mother and his sister, and his mother feeling that he's no good, and Tony trying to get between his boss and his boss's woman. And there are plenty of little Easter eggs from that film, the original movie, like certain lines right out of that film that are used in this film as well. And this movie has its own style and its own flair, which really makes it kind of stand apart from the original. This is a morality tale, which does focus eventually on the downside of the life of crime and what can happen in terms of consequences from choosing this kind of life and making all the wrong choices and being a downright evil person in the end. And the movie doesn't shy away in giving you that message. And Al Pacino is one of the main draws of this film with his incredible performance. And this is a movie that, if you're into great acting, definitely check out this film. This is a movie for crime fans, Pacino fans, and overall fans of a good drama. Even action movie fans can get a lot out of this movie since there is plenty of action to be had here as well. But this is a classic of the 80s, one of the most memorable films of the decade, and I highly encourage anybody that's into crime films to check this one out. It is one of the greatest and one of my favorite films ever. Number 3 is a movie from 1985 directed by Steven Spielberg, The Color Purple, based on the novel by Alice Walker. This is the story of two black underprivileged country girls that suffer a very bad abuse on the hands of their father, and for the rest of the film, one of them keeps suffering that abuse at the hands of a husband. This is a movie that is very heartfelt, very emotional, can be very hard to watch, but by the end of the film, you're very glad that you watched it because it has a tremendous payoff and there are great performances in this film. The film has Whoopi Goldberg as Celie, Akusa Busia as Nettie, you have Oprah Winfrey as the character of Sophia, and you also have as the character of Albert, Danny Glover, who is so good in this movie, especially since he really makes you hate his character. And at the beginning of the film, we see Celie and Nettie as young girls, and Celie is constantly being very protective of her sister Nettie, as Nettie is being abused sexually by her father to the point where she even gives birth to two children because of her father. Celie and Nettie's creep of a father has Nettie's children sent away, which really breaks Nettie's heart. And it's not long after that when Albert comes along, played by Danny Glover, who I mentioned, who has his eye on Nettie at first because he thinks she's kind of attractive, even though she is pretty young at the time. But the father wants to keep her for himself, basically, and so he allows her to get with his daughter Celie, who then goes off with Albert, basically just handed over by her own dad. Nettie couldn't stand to be with her abusive father anymore, so in her arrival at Albert and Celie's place, there is a bit of relief for only a brief moment, but it's not very long after her arrival that Albert starts to get ideas about trying to get her into the sack, basically, which of course she refuses and fights him off, at which point he kicks her off of his place. Watching the two sisters, Nellie and Celie, being separated at that moment really breaks your heart when you watch it. Oprah Winfrey also does a very good job in the film in the role of Sophia, who marries one of Albert's sons when everyone's grown up, and she is kind of a more strong person than Celie, since Celie's kind of meek all throughout the film due to her experiences of suffering abuse at the hands of her father and her husband. And there's so much to get into regarding this film. I do have a review of this film on my channel because I love this film so much. It is one of my favorite films of this decade. And if you enjoy a good drama, a good period drama, and just an overall great movie experience, you should definitely check out The Color Purple. The Color Purple is a movie that stays with me long after I watch it, and it's a movie that I want to come to every now and then just to kind of remember what it's like to feel something. And this is one of those movies that will definitely make you feel something. This is one of the greatest movies of the 1980s, and it's one of my favorite films of all time, which is why it makes my list at number 3. Okay, number 2. Raging Bull from 1980, directed by Martin Scorsese, starring the great Robert De Niro, co-starring Joe Pesci. Raging Bull is a story based on the true life of Jake LaMotta. I'm not sure exactly how accurate the movie is in terms of depicting the real life of Jake LaMotta. All I know is this movie is very entertaining. This is a film that came out in 1980, so it could have been in color, but Scorsese made the wise decision to shoot the movie in black and white, which makes this film feel very authentic for the time period in which it takes place during the 1940s and the 50s. It kind of spans a couple of decades, and it feels very timeless because of the black and white look. The performances in this movie are excellent from everybody involved. Of course, De Niro would win himself his second Oscar for this film. The character of Jake LaMotta can be a very unlikable guy to watch. You don't watch this movie rooting for this character. You just watch this movie kind of like watching a car wreck that you can't look away from. That's basically Raging Bull. The entire movie is one big piece of great, riveting drama with superb performances and stellar dialogue all throughout the film that really engages you. You also get to see Jake LaMotta at the end of his fight career in his later years after he's ruined his life basically by the way he's mistreated his whole family and those around him that have really been there from the beginning. And it's very sad to see the kind of rise and then the fall and the decline of the character. Martin Scorsese has directed some of the greatest films ever made. He's made some classics, movies like Taxi Driver, Casino, Goodfellas, Mean Streets, Bringing Out the Dead, Gangs of New York, The Departed. It goes on and on. The man has made some terrific movies. From The Last Temptation of Christ to Hugo, from The Color of Money to Kundun. He has all kinds of great movies under his belt. And for me, even though I consider Goodfellas his number one, for me, my number two film from Martin Scorsese is Raging Bull. And it's not just my number two Scorsese film, it is my number two film of the 1980s. It's one of the greatest films ever made, and I highly encourage anyone that hasn't seen this film, seek this one out, check it out. For cinephiles, for De Niro fans, for Scorsese fans, Raging Bull is a hell of an experience and a once in a lifetime movie. Yes, sir. Or ma'am. Okie dokie, here we go. Time for number one. My number one film of the 1980s, my top 25 is, well, this is a box set, but if you want to guess which one, it's what does Duke say in Rocky 4? Look at the one in the middle. Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back. The Empire Strikes Back is a monumental achievement in filmmaking, not just for special effects, but in terms of having a trilogy and telling a story from beginning to end and having your beginning chapter starting with the hero's tale of a young man sort of trying to find his place in the world, finding a mentor. Then you have the middle chapter, which is this film where things get really dark and intense and the characters find themselves in impossible situations. Then you have the final chapter, which is where they get themselves out of those situations and find some kind of peace and triumph. That is the way Lucas explains how great drama works, and there is no better display of that to me, anyways, than these first three Star Wars films. And for me, Episode 5 is the best. This movie does a great job with really deepening the lore, really adding to the mythology by adding characters like Yoda and Lando Calrissian, who are standouts in the movie. I think out of the first three films, Mark Hamill gives his best performance as Luke Skywalker, and I think this is the most imposing and most evil that we get to see Darth Vader be until Rogue One, that is. And of course, Carrie Fisher is so great to watch as Leia and really seeing her kind of evolve from the princess that was captured in the first film to this fighter and leader, which is a great evolution for her character. Overall, I feel that The Empire Strikes Back is one of the greatest films of all time. I feel like it is kind of an upgrade from the first film, which does really improve on a lot of the effects. I think this is classic Star Wars. It is the epitome of Star Wars, and it's the epitome of great cinema, in my opinion. It is one of the greatest films to come out of the 1980s. To me, it is number one, and I love it to death. It is my favorite film of the decade, which is why I had to put it at the top spot of number one. The Empire Strikes Back, Star Wars Episode 5, my favorite film of the 1980s. Thank you all very much for watching this classic movie review list. And I know that there are a lot of movies that I left out. Believe me, I would have loved to included more movies like Predator and movies like Beetlejuice and Ghostbusters and of course the Karate Kid and there's so many great movies that I haven't mentioned that I would have loved to have thrown in this list, but I had to narrow it down to 25. This was a very hard list to nail down. And I love so many other films, but again, I had to keep it at 25. Again, I want to say if there's anything that you feel I left out or you would have put on your own list, please put it down in the comment section for me. It doesn't have to be a list of 25 titles. Just throw in a couple of titles that you would have liked to have seen on this list yourself. But I'm going to get out of here now. Thank you very much for watching this very lengthy video. I appreciate it. I appreciate your support. Those of you that are new to the channel, if you're into classic films, all I talk about is the classics mainly. Every now and then I might talk about something new, but for the most part, I am a classic movie kind of guy on this channel. So hit the bell if you're into that kind of thing. Subscribe. If you're new to the channel, I appreciate you watching. If you're a returning viewer, thank you very much for your support. I always appreciate it. Please don't forget to share because that really helps the channel if you want to. And if you like the video, leave a like and look out for the next classic movie review. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Take care of each other. Bye-bye.